Hi there, and welcome to Supervising Remote Work Strategies for Success. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I also want to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land in which we're all situated, regardless of where we're watching this video from. So welcome to Supervising Remote Work Strategies for Success. In this presentation, I'll go over a number of tips and strategies to help you manage working with a team that's not working in the same place as you. So the learning objectives for this session are to identify the components of establishing productive routines early on in the work term, identifying strategies and resources for addressing challenges with working from home remotely, being able to articulate professionalism and professional best practices for communication, and we'll also compare some online platforms for project mapping and productivity. So I'll go over each of these in more detail in a moment, but I just want to touch on the components of establishing productive routines that include setting expectations, communicating needs to supervisors, and understanding communication plans. These three things are going to be really critical to pass along to your student employees so that they can better understand what's expected, how to communicate, and when. I'll talk more about each of these in detail in a moment, but I just want to go over the components of establishing productive routines early on. So this includes setting expectations, communicating needs to supervisors, and understanding communication plans, the type, the frequency, and when this is going to all happen. So I'll go over each of these in more detail in a moment, but I just want to highlight some of the components of establishing productive routines early on in the work term. So these could include setting expectations, communicating needs to supervisors, and understanding the communication plans. In terms of setting expectations, this is something that should be happening early on into the work term, but is something that will also adjust as we go. So I think it's a good idea to make sure that we have expectations that are flexible, achievable, realistic, and effective. We're all managing this crisis in our personal and professional lives, and I think the only way that we can all be productive is to do it together and to have honest conversations about what our expectations are, as well as when we need to adjust, having that conversation together. So I would really encourage students to be realistic and honest about how they're feeling and what they think they can accomplish. Establishing the norm of checking in and being honest with where we're at, I think is a really key thing to setting up a successful supervisory relationship with a student right now. I'd also acknowledge that students will likely need to be more independent earlier on. We don't have the same informal spaces to check in and ask as many questions as we may like. I think it's important that we also acknowledge that students will likely need to be more independent earlier on because they're not going to have the same level of access to their supervisor as they might be used to. I'd also encourage students to think about when, where, and how they're most productive and ask them to schedule activities that require more creativity, more cognitive load during those times. In terms of professionalism and professional best practices for communication, this is going to look slightly different for every team. And again, I just encourage this to be a conversation that you have with your students. That being said, I think there's some best practices that we can all follow and encourage that will greatly help everyone get the information that they need. So for email, definitely encourage your student employees to use the subject field, making sure that there's always a clear and concise subject in an email line, making sure they understand the use of CC and BCC, make sure they're aware of what response times within your unit are, as well as having an appropriate signature in each email. For Zoom and Skype, again, this is going to look slightly different for every team, but encouraging muting ourselves when we're not talking, creating a distraction-free space as much as possible, having your face visible, and treating it like you're stepping into an actual meeting. Now, of course, I'd also encourage a dialogue with your student employees around if they want to keep their video off, when it's appropriate to do that, and when you'd prefer that they're actually fully present in a meeting. On that note, encourage people to communicate challenges early on and often. Encouraging this type of communication is also a part of professionalism. Not everything always goes according to plan, and sometimes we have life things we need to deal with. The important thing is that your employees are communicating this to you sooner rather than later. And documentation. It's difficult to remember everything that we hear, especially if we're in a bunch of Zoom calls all day. And maybe that will help us consider other modes of communication and a place where important information and various to-dos can be recorded. But have a conversation with your students around making sure they have some way of tracking the things that are being brought up in meetings. Often professional practices that are really clear and obvious to us aren't always clear to people coming in new to a role, especially if somebody's new to working remotely. So first I'm going to talk about some challenges of remote work, and then I'm going to talk about some of the solutions for them. I think it's important to acknowledge right off the bat that timelines for projects are disrupted and unpredictable. That right now is a reality for just about everyone. Students will also learn asynchronously, so they're going to learn at different times and at different speeds, which can be especially challenging if you're onboarding a group of student employees. Also, the ability for students to process information might be much lower at times, so make sure you're having conversations with them about what's feasible, making sure you're anticipating challenges, and also being clear about when to communicate those challenges coming up. So, in terms of the solutions to those challenges, we know timelines are disrupted and unpredictable, so it's important that we establish clearly defined times during the day, and ideally in different places of our homes or wherever we're working remotely, to separate our work and personal life. I really encourage you to share what's worked for you with your student employees, because this is something that they may not be practiced at, and we shouldn't assume that working remotely is something that they've done before. In terms of the solution to the limited contact with mentors and peers, and make sure that we're establishing at the very least regular check-ins for students to connect with each other. So this is something that could happen every week. It might be something that only needs to happen once a month, but making sure that if you have a student team, there's a regular opportunity for those students to talk to each other. If you're just working with one student, make sure that those regular check-ins are happening for you and the student. The quote I've shared here at the bottom is, "There's a risk of productivity collapse as people burn out, can't cope, feel exhausted, and opt out." I think this is really important to remember when we think about potential challenges, is that we want to be as aware of these things as possible and have an honest and ongoing dialogue about how we're all feeling and where we're all at emotionally, and in terms of our energy levels, to make sure that we can best support students throughout the term as the workload shifts and changes. So students learn asynchronously at different times and at different speeds. So I think it's important that we move from theory first and then to the window of application. So first of all, we're looking at what are the foundational practices and theories that underpin our work. And then we're moving into the space of actually applying that knowledge to do the job. Acknowledging that cognitive load will be much lower at times, so just the amount of information that any one person can absorb and communicate at a time can shift depending on what else is going on. So have conversations about what's feasible, look ahead to see if you can anticipate any challenges that might come up, and also talk about when to communicate those challenges. It's very difficult for students already to approach their supervisors with challenges, and it's even more difficult when they're working remotely and they haven't built that face-to-face rapport with their supervisors. And of course, encourage everyone to establish screen breaks. So online platforms for project mapping and productivity. I'd really encourage, as a starting point, consider using tools that students are already familiar with. This is mainly because it takes time to learn new systems. That being said, you might already have well-established practices and systems within your workspace. I'm not saying you should move away from those, but I do think it's a good idea to ask students what they're already familiar with using, and making sure that new tools and platforms aren't creating more of a barrier to getting work done than they're actually solving. I'd also remember that productivity tools should be used to encourage participation rather than enforce productivity. We're all navigating extreme circumstances, and we want tools that help us all communicate and get work done. But also remember that productivity tools should be used to encourage participation rather than enforce productivity. I'd also remember that tracking tasks is more effective than tracking time. If we say something will take 10 hours, we will often work to that amount of time rather than break a project into smaller tasks and work to complete each task. So encourage whatever platform you're using, encourage your students to take a look at dividing things into smaller tasks rather than just looking at a chunk of time and saying, okay, I've got 10 hours to complete this work this week, and only look at that. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's a list of a few different tools that you can use to map productivity and projects. So Slack is a popular one. Lots of teams use it. It's a single place for messaging, offers various other productivity tools, as well as exchanging files. This is something that probably students are maybe more familiar with, but is a great place for teams to be able to communicate and also can help cut down on the number of emails that need to be sent within a team. Asana is a very similar web and mobile app that's designed to help teams organize, track, and manage their work. Slack and Asana are similar with some differences, as well as Basecamp. And essentially, these all allow you to manage teams and projects, all with slight variations in terms of how that's done. So I'd encourage you to take a look. These are the three big ones. Certainly, there's other ones available as well. Microsoft Teams, another platform that combines the workplace chat function, video meetings, file storage. So this is a little bit more robust than Slack, Asana, and Basecamp in some regards, but it is also a more complicated platform and might take a little bit longer to learn. Google Sheets, where appropriate, looking at the use of Gantt charts, simple ways to collaboratively work on documents, I think is something that we really want to encourage. So if we're not sharing sensitive information, these can be useful tools to simply share a document and be able to work off of the same digital workplace without sending documents back and forth. And last, but certainly not least, is trust. Trust that your student employees will complete their work. And I would really focus on our conversations and our rapport with each other to get things done, rather than feeling like we're creating an office atmosphere of surveillance rather than getting the work done that we need to get done. So this is a little quote I found from the Solomon Consulting Group that I really like, and I think it speaks to that trust point. And that's that not everyone can work from home or a remote office. But if you've hired self-starters who are intrinsically motivated for such positions, that's all the tracking you need. Software programs are all well and good, but with a small team, you'll know if someone isn't pulling their weight. Making your remote team use tracking tools can give their jobs a big brother vibe, which nobody wants. Again, focus on the relationships rather than trying to oversee every element of the work. So some strategies and resources that you can share with your student employees are encouraging them to pick a spot for working and try to make work the main or the only thing that they do there. I'd also encourage them to set up a comfortable place they can sit or stand for a few hours at a time. All the links that I've shared in this video are in the video description, and here you can look at the UBC Ergonomics Guide for working from home as an example. I'd also encourage students to let friends, family members, and classmates know when they're going to work. This is really difficult to manage in the remote workplace. I'm sure it's something that you've experienced yourself as well, but just encouraging communication with the people around us to let them know, I'm going to be in Zoom meetings this afternoon, so I need it to be as quiet as possible. Those aren't always conversations that students are practiced at having yet, so just maybe a point to check in with them early on in the term. Of course, I'd also encourage them to silence any unnecessary notifications on our devices. If somebody's going into a Zoom call on their phone, certainly you want to make sure you have your notifications turned off, and ultimately making sure that we're able to get away from all the things that might be distracting us in our space wherever we're working remotely as much as possible. And of course, setting focused amounts of time to get work done with short breaks in between. So if you're looking for more resources, you can check the video description below for all the links to what's been shown in this video, as well as these resources here. So I want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that is going into supervision right now. Supervising remotely is by no means easy, but I hope that these tips and strategies serve you well as you work remotely with your team.